Samples, exactly, sure. We're on? Okay, great. So, Gid hanasheh. We're not to eat from, I guess it's called the sciatica nerve, or the vein, the Shir, what is it called? We're not sure actually what it is. Some say it's very minimal, just the vein. Others say it's the entire, sinew, thank you, which is a more broader term. I knew there was something there. Okay, so we're going to begin, as we always do, with the Sefer Chinuch. That's the English on the first page and the second page. The Hebrew to the right in the other column is the Hebrew translation, or I should say the English is the English translation of the Hebrew. So, Shelo lechol haPesach na umevushal. This is one mitzvah, says the Sefer Chinuch. The Ramban quotes these as two separate mitzvot. You're not to eat the Korban Pesach. Na, we'll have to understand what that concept na means. It is not, in biblical Hebrew, na is what? Behold, or I pray, or something along those lines. I remember first coming to Israel, and the only Hebrew that I really knew was what I knew, biblical Hebrew, and I would talk to the taxi driver and say, "Nah, please now let me come, hine, higanu, please let me descend from your taxi at this point in time." But that's not the meaning of na at this point in time. Na we'll come to in a moment. Mivushal we understand. Mivushal is a form of cooking. You're not allowed to have the Korban Pesach cooked. What's mivushal? It's cooked with water. It's boiling. Okay, and there's different forms of cooking, and we'll see those as well. Shelo lechol basar haPesach. You're not to eat this na uvashel. You shouldn't eat it na and cooked or boiled. Ki'im tzli esh. Only roasted by fire. Both of those terms, roasted by fire. That's the determining factor, and perhaps that's why the Sefer Chinuch feels comfortable saying it's one mitzvah. Roasted by fire is the mitzvah, and the negative is either if it's na or mivushal. I'm just now moving to the English. The nub of the matter is that it should not be eaten before its preparation for eating. Na means before something is ready. In other words, na is you've begun to cook it, you've begun to roast it, you've done everything kosher up until now. You have the fire, it's being roasted, but you stop. You don't finish the process. Before it's ready to be eaten, according to the majority of people, you jump in and you begin to eat it. And we're going to talk about that concept of not being able to wait until something is fully prepared. So he says the nub of the matter is that it should not be eaten before its preparation for eating, even by roasting, meaning even if you're doing it the proper way, until it's completed. For this is the meaning of na, flesh on which the action of the fire has begun to take effect, and it is slightly roasted, but is not yet fit for a person to eat. That's what's called na. When it is completely raw, and then he goes on and talks just sort of technically about whether it's a deraita or derabanan. If you eat it when it's totally raw, right? The Torah doesn't prohibit actually eating it totally raw. The rabbis do. But obviously, the real issue is that you've started the process, but you can't wait until it's fully finished. And we have an actual verse in the Torah. As I've always said, the Sefer Chinuch will give us the sources of each of the mitzvot. And then the term boiled, if you look 4 lines up from the bottom of the first paragraph, the term boiled, mivushal, applies if it was cooked with water or any beverage, with fruit juice, whatever the case may be. The verb is doubled, right? There's 2 times, vashel and mivushal. That means boiled traditionally with water or any other form of liquid. And this includes all forms of cooking. What is the reason behind this mitzvah? So I've alluded to one already about the ability to wait. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but let me just give you the Sefer Chinuch's real answer. And we're going to talk more about his answer actually in next week's class. At the root of this precept lies the purpose written about in the Passover offering, the ritual slaying, which we saw last week, that we should remember the miracle of the Exodus from Egypt. There are about 10 mitzvot related to Pesach, and the Sefer Chinuch gives the exact same reason for all of them. There's different dimensions, but they're all about remembering the Exodus, remembering the miracles. We spoke about miracles last week. That is why we were commanded to eat it specifically roasted, for this is the way, and now he gives us 2 almost contradictory reasons. This is the way of royal princes and rulers. They eat things roasted. If you go to the next page, he continues with this thought. Right, do I have it on the next page? To eat roast meat, since it is good and savory food. Okay? The rest of the people, they eat a little bit of meat, which they manage to afford in no other way but boiled, so they fill their stomachs. There is an anthropologist by the name of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he talks about this thing called the culinary triangle. The culinary triangle is how ancients used to cook their foods and the sort of the hierarchy of this type of cooking. He says the lowest form of cooking is boiling. Why is the low? He says it's also the least natural because you have to use a kli, a vessel, to actually do the cooking. So on some hand, it actually is the most advanced in terms of technologically speaking, but it's also the lowest class form of cooking. Why? Well, you have to just you don't lose anything, right? You put everything in, and then you put the water. You don't even lose the water. Very often, you use the water as well for the soup. You cut up different pieces. You throw everything in. By the way, that's another reason why perhaps if we want to pick up on what we said last week about the concept of unity, you can't boil because once you boil, you no longer are having a whole animal. And we spoke about the importance of having a whole animal symbolic of the entire people eating this food. So you throw it all in, nothing is wasted whatsoever. And he says, sociologically speaking, very often boiling food was done in small groups. It was amongst the family very often. And it was very often sort of the lower class who would cook this way. The royals, or when you had special guests come over, was the roasting. And when you would roast, first of all, you lose food, right? You're cooking it over there, you lose food. Only the wealthy felt comfortable losing that valuable protein and fat and all those things that would drip after. So this is a sign of perhaps the royalty that is taking place. And we're less worried about filling our stomach simply with with quantity, but we're looking for quality at this point in time. And we want to think about being kings, as he goes on, to become a kingdom of Kohanim and a holy nation. Then it is certainly fitting us for to behave while eating it in the manner of freedom and lordship. That is the roasted, and therefore it's important to roast and not cooking it in that regard. And then he gives a second answer, which I say is almost contradictory. He says, why did they eat roasting? Because roasting is much faster than boiling. If you boil, it takes a long time, and they didn't have time, and we also want to remember sort of the leaving from Egypt. So he gives us those two answers. As I say, they're contradictory. One is royalty, you're being served, a freedom, you're not in any rush whatsoever, and the other is you're rushing out. We're going to talk a lot more about the concept of freedom and eating like a king next week when we talk about the mitzvah of not breaking the bone of the Korban Pesach. There is a sign really of royalty, and he speaks about that more, so we'll spend more time on that when we get there. For now, I want to go back to the first concept, the roasting it and not being able to wait. Because I'd like to suggest that this inability to wait for something to be done is a very human characteristic, and it's also one of the great flaws that I think Jewish law is coming to sort of correct, to let us know that we have to be patient, we have to be able to appreciate sort of the small moments and the process that things take. And you see it in a lot of our sort of paradigmatic stories. You see it, I think, most highlighted with the stories of Yaakov and Esav, right? What does Esav say? Esav, right, he's starving. And he says, give me that red stuff. It's interesting to note, by the way, the red stuff. Yaakov has the name of being red, right? Edom. He's, I'm sorry, thank you, Esav. Most commentaries say it's not because he was born red, although we're given an indication of that. In fact, there was a scientist who had a fascinating explanation of why he might have been born red and a little bit more hairy, a little bit more asui, right? The name Esav is asui. It's like already pre-made, already done, already completed. And that's what Esav represents. Not waiting. I'm already done. I'm already prepared. So there's a syndrome called TTTS. You can look it up when you go home. I can't remember what all the T's stand for. I know that one of them stands for transfer, and one of them is syndrome or symptom or something along those lines. What is TTTS? It's when you have twins and they share the same umbilical cord. And it's actually, or they share one that goes between them. It's actually quite dangerous for the mother, as well as both of the children, because they begin to fight over the resources inside the womb. It's like the sharks that are inside a shark's womb, that they're like the strongest one is already eating up the weaker ones. And so what happens here is that the two twins start fighting over limited resources, and one of them, once sort of gets the tipping point, becomes stronger, they begin to absorb much, much more. The other one becomes sort of weaker, and will come out more pale because it hasn't gotten as much blood and nutrients. The other one, the larger one, becomes much larger. It's getting many more resources and receives many more nutrients, and very often comes out more complete, hairier, and redder because they've gotten so much more of the blood. And the other one will come out smaller and more pale, which, if you think about it, actually fairly accurately describes the Torah's description of the battle between Yaakov and Esav. It started inside the womb, and they come out really indicative of this syndrome. But they're not identical. Okay.
Because usually if you have unidentical twins, they're two separate individuals with separate,
Right, well, this is not an ideal thing. When this happens, I hate to say it, very often... Oh, okay. Very often, if this TTTS happens, very often the mother can die. Certainly, the weaker child almost always dies. It's a very high percentage. And it can be very dangerous also for the stronger one as well, because he gets too much. He gets too much blood and could overcome him. So it sort of adds to the miracle of Yaakov, if you think about it for a moment, and it adds to the miracle of the Jewish people, in fact, that at their very birth is a miracle of sorts. You were going to ask something. Hold on. Yeah. So the struggle's there. But what's interesting, I think, is that the Chazal don't call Esav red because he came out red. They call it connected to this story. The story of he calls this food the red stuff. Now, what is this red stuff? We always talk about it as being lentils of some sort, right? Have you ever seen red lentils cooked? Yeah, and they're red at the end? No, they're brown. They're red at the beginning. Or orange. This is an insight. Aaron Razel, the singer, was once eating at our house, and it just hit him. He says, "It doesn't make any sense." He was telling us this story about patience. He has written a song or a tune for Shir Hamalot. I would sing it for you if I had any talent, but it's a very difficult Shir Hamalot to actually sing. And he once told us this story. He was walking in Tzfat, and he's walking around, after Shabbat dinner, and he's just walking the streets. It's very, mystical and romantic. And he hears from one of the windows, people are about to bench, and they're using his tune for Shir Hamalot, and they're slaughtering it. They're doing a terrible job. And he's standing at the door, and he says, "Wouldn't this be the greatest thing in the world if I just jump in and say, no, you're doing it wrong. This is how you're supposed to sing the song." But he doesn't, and he waits, and he has his patience, and they finally come around, and they begin to sing it, and he continues walking on. And in this vein of this idea of being able to hold back, to have some patience, he says it hits him that these lentils are orange or red when you begin cooking, but at the end they become more, brown or dark, right? So he says, when he calls this red stuff, what does that mean? It means Yaakov just started cooking it. They're hard. They haven't really been cooked at all. He still wants it. He still doesn't care, and he still eats it. He just swallows it down. Can you imagine swallowing down those not raw, maybe it's been cooked for a little bit. I started cooking beans. It's an incredibly arduous process. You have to soak it for, a day, and then you have to boil it for hours. In my case, after you boil it for hours, you also have to forget about it and then burn them completely, right? So he has this lack of patience, and he just can't wait for it. And you see it again and again in their interactions. Think about, for example, when Yaakov returns after his exile. He comes back, and Esav says, "Let's reunite, let's go together." And what is Yaakov's excuse why he can't go with him, he can't travel with him? He's hungry, or no, he says, he gives him a few different excuses, but one of the ones he says is, I have all these young kids, we're slow, we'll slow you down, I'll meet up with you later. And Esav could have said, if he really wanted him to join with him, and it seems like he really did. If you remember, we spoke about this with regards to Gid and Nashed, that Esav was making a genuine offer to Yaakov, let's rule the world together. And he could have said, that's okay, we'll go a little slower, we'll walk with you. And he can't do it, right? You see this all the time, right? You see the kids sort of dragging behind the adults, and some adults, just can't take it. I was actually on Karen and I saw yesterday, and there was a mother who couldn't take her child anymore, dragging along. She said, I'm going, and she's going. And the kid actually jumped on the bus. And the mother couldn't believe it. She's then chasing after the bus to stop it to get on. But it happens. Some people just don't have that patience in that regard. You see, by the way, the exact same story with regards to Moshe and Paro. Right after the seventh plague, Paro says what? You can leave. You can go. But who can go? Only the men. And Moshe says, no, we're going with the women, we're going with the children, we're going with the old, we're going with everyone. And Paro, it just doesn't register. It doesn't make any sense to him, because why would you want to be slowed down by all these other people? And Moshe's making a principal statement. He says, no, that's the Jewish people, right? We spoke about last week about unity and the diversity and the strength in the diversity. Moshe's saying that's how we are strong, not if we simply focus on the strong. And again, it happens in the conflict between the Jewish people and their nemesis. Last story, again with Yaakov and Esav. One of the problems I've always had in the text is Esav is starving. He says, I'll sell you, I'll give you my birthright because it's not worth anything to me, because what is it worth it for me if I'm going to die anyway? So it seems a little bit inappropriate for Yaakov to sort of, in a sense, take advantage of his brother who's going to die unless he eats food. It seems like that sale, many people would not count that sale as legitimate if there's such coercion of, in order to live, you make a deal. But that's not how you need to understand that story at all. There's another way of understanding that story. The other way is to say, Esav and Yaakov are fighting over the birthright. What is the birthright? The birthright is to Eretz Yisrael. Neither brother is going to actualize the birthright here and now. Right? The birthright is going to be after Yaakov and the Bnei Yisrael go to Egypt, after they're enslaved for hundreds of years, after they come out. That's the birthright. Who then gets Eretz Yisrael at this point in time? So Esav looks at that and says, I'm going to die. Meaning, not that I'm going to die right now, but I'm going to die before I ever see the actualization of this birthright. So it's not worth a cent to me. He thinks he actually gets a good deal. That porridge is actually a good deal because he at least gets something. Yaakov says, no, I'm preparing for the future. Even if I never see personal benefit from it, I know that someone is going to benefit. My children, my grandchildren will benefit, so therefore it's worth it. Esav doesn't have the patience or the vision to see into the future, and therefore he says it's not worth it, anything to me at all. So exactly. By the way, modern sociologists, by the way, make a very similar point. I hadn't thought about it until just now when you said two in the bush, but it's perhaps the most written about experiment in the last, maybe 50 years. It's called the Marshmallow Experiment. Are you familiar with this? They take the Marshmallow Experiment. Marshmallow, yes. There's an experiment with marshmallows. It happened, I think, already in the 60s when it first started, but it's been repeated many times since. What they did is they take two young children into a room, and they give the child a marshmallow. And they say to the child, you can eat this now, or if you wait 15 minutes, I'll come back and I'll bring you another marshmallow. And they just, the kid, I can't remember, I think 5, 6, or 7 years old. They're young kids. 4? Okay, thank you. So different things happen. First of all, some of the kids eat the marshmallow right away. Some of the kids struggle, right, with the willpower. Some of the kids, by the way, give us insight. If you're struggling with willpower of how to deal with it, they hide the marshmallow. They look away, because if looking at it creates part of the tension, so they give us this insight. And some of them wait the whole time and they make it. Then the real power of the experiment is that they follow these children for decades, and they see what's happened differently in their lives. And some of the children, for example, there's a big difference in terms of their health, in terms of their social adjustment, in terms of their academic excellence, in terms of they eventually see what kind of careers these children even get. And it all harkens back to when they were 4 and whether or not they were successful in having the patience and the ability to wait for that second marshmallow. So here too, a marshmallow in the hand is better than 2 in the experimenter's hands, but not true. But not true. If you have the long-term vision, it's actually a different story. You can see this idea in another important story as well. And it's not just the idea that we should have patience, but during that patience, during that time, realize that this is not downtime. There is meaning and significance in the process as we wait. It's not just having the ability to wait and do nothing, but to actually invest that nothing time period with great meaning. A story I told in my shul a number of years ago on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur was this story about a father and a son who were swimming off the coast of Florida, and the son and father, they got drifted out to sea a little bit. And unfortunately, the son had autism, and because he had autism, the only way they could keep in touch.
What did they take out?
No, they drifted out to sea.
Oh, they drifted.
And there was a tide, and they didn't realize they were out, and then all of a sudden they look, and the father and the son get separated, and the son has autism, and so the way the father tried to stay connected to his son, he's only 11 years old, was to quote from a movie, the Toy Story, to infinity. It's a quote from a cartoon movie, to infinity, and the son would finish the line, and beyond. And that's how they would stay in touch. And eventually the father, it's getting darker and darker. There's a sister on the beach who's looking for them, trying to find them. She starts calling the Coast Guard to look for them. Eventually the father can't hear the son anymore. It's now dark. Helicopters are going up looking for them, but they've gotten pulled further and further and further out to sea, and no one can find them. The sun comes up, right, 12 hours later, and finally one of the Coast Guard boats sees the father. And they pull the father in, and you can imagine, 12 hours in the darkness of the sea, shark infested, who knows what's going on, the fear and just the pure exhaustion. But he survived, he made it. And they pull him up, and he's exhausted, he just collapses on the boat. And of course, the first thing he says is, "Have you found my son?" And they say, "We haven't found your son yet." And everyone has only the absolute worst fears of what might have happened to this 11-year-old boy. Anyway, a little while later, they spot the boy. Thank God he's alive. They pull him up, and in great contrast to the father, he's in a great mood. And they say, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Yes, I had a wonderful time. It was great," all these different things. And they're trying to understand, how could he, an 11-year-old boy, the vastness of the ocean, who knows what kind of animals, the fear, the darkness, and he says it was great. So how could he have said it was great? So his doctor, when they sort of did the exit interview, came to understand the following, that the boy, because of his autism, he can't see beyond that which is right in front of him. And so, for example, the first time he went into the wave, right, a wave hits him, that's fun. Right, for all of us, it's fun. The wave hits you in the ocean. And then the 10th time, it's still fun, but there's diminishing returns. By the 1000th time, it's, boring. You no longer even notice it, or, it wears on you. But not so for him. The 1000th time and the 2000th time, each time the wave came, it was like the very first wave. So it was exciting for him again and again and again. So there's a great sort of lesson to learn from this, of being able to be excited about an experience, and it also then invests long periods of time with greater, deeper meaning. I'll tell you where you can see this a lot. Think of your last vacation, okay? Who remembers? Okay, I'm glad you said that. How many of you remember one of your last vacations, okay? And can you remember, think about it for a moment, what you did and what you saw on that vacation? Now, what did you do 3 days ago?
3 days.
Yeah, who knows, right?
The same thing I do every day.
Exactly, it's exactly right. When you go on vacation, you go to a new place that you've never seen before. You invest it with greater meaning because you're antennas are up. This is new to me. It's like the wave. It's exciting, and therefore time actually feels longer. You know, you can extend time, right? You know, a 2-day vacation, sometimes in your memory, 30 years later, 40 years later, you can remember it, and you can invest it, and it feels longer. You've invested, you know, a period of time with a great meaning. You can't remember what you did 2 or 3 days ago, because you know what? You've seen the 2 or 3 days ago a million times, right? You've seen it again and again and again. That's why it feels like life's going faster as we get older, because you've already seen this day, and therefore you don't stop and pause and appreciate that day, and so the days just fly. You remember as a kid, at least for me, I remember summertime as a kid on my bike. A summer day felt like it lasted for days, forever and ever. A summer day today, not as much, because I've done it, I've seen it. And so there's this great value of investing time and making the most of time by being able to pay attention to it. That's, I think, part of what Yaakov is doing, and I think part of this mitzvah of roasting, okay? It says, you want just the food at the end, and you don't care, and you don't have the patience, right? You want it right now. I've been to barbecues where people will burn their hands in order to take the hot dogs off the grill before it's ready. So lesson 1 is you have to have patience, but lesson 2 is to actually appreciate the in-between stages of that cooking. That it's not just have patience until it's ready, but to realize that something is taking place during that process. And I think we can see that if we look at the Minchat Chinuch on this mitzvah. So that's the most of the Hebrew, the rest of the Hebrew on the first page. Yes.
The whole purpose of the roasting, according to the saying right now, is so it's done quickly.
Well, it's a little bit of a conflict. The opposite. The roasting is much faster than cooking. But once you're in the world of roasting, there's 2 things that the Torah could have said. The Torah could have said, listen, can you imagine the Jews wanting anything more than getting out of Egypt? They could have just said, get it to the bare minimum stage where I can now eat this. Just a little bit, right? Malchut ben Drusai is a third cooked. Get it to a third cooked. We'll eat it. Let's run before Paro changes his mind. It's true that roasting is much faster than boiling, but once we're in the world of roasting, that could have been an argument, and God could have said, especially if we're supposed to remember the mitzvah of we left in haste. What's a better way of remembering? In the same way we eat matzah rather than bread, the Torah could have said, dafka eat meat that is roasted right? Only a third, or only that would have been a great way of remembering that. The Torah goes out of its way to say, no, you may not do that with regards to the roasted meat. You have to wait until the entire process is complete. And I think we can see that in, as I said, some of the sources that I brought of the Minchas Chinuch. Okay, so look at on the lower half of the page, on the right-hand column. We're going to look this page, all the Hebrew and the lower. This is from the Minchat Chinuch, who I mentioned in times past, likes to ask great halachic questions on the Sefer Chinuch. So we're going to look at a few different questions that he asks. We're not going to necessarily see all of his answers, but the questions themselves raise, I think, an interesting point. The first one, it may be cut off. For some of you, I apologize. The first, at the very top, it says bet. I should get one that you have so I can see if it's cut off or not. It says, do you see that where it says Mivuar Kan B'Shas? It's explained in Shas and Rambam. Kama dinim she'eno na ve'eno mevushal. What happens if you have an example where the meat is neither roasted nor boiled? Okay? There's a couple of possibilities. One possibility is you don't fulfill the mitzvah of eating Korban Pesach, but you didn't violate the commandment of eating it na or mevushal. Okay? Anyway, he raises that question. He says, well, give me an example that's something that's not cooked nor roasted. So in the second line he says, kagon, for example, if it were raw, okay, or if it was roasted on some other type of material, not the coals, or the Chamei Tiberia. Chamei Tiberia are the hot springs of Tiberia. it's boiling water, but he's saying apparently there might have been people who would hold the spit over the water, so it wasn't boiled. They didn't put it in the water, right? As you're taking your nice jacuzzi, someone didn't all of a sudden bring a piece of meat and stick it there as well, but they would hold it over it. And the steam is a form of roasting almost. So he says, what happens if you're roasted, but not with fire? Do you fulfill the mitzvah? He says, no, that doesn't count as fulfilling the mitzvah. It's important not just the end product, that the meat would appear roasted, but the way it's done as well. By the way, this is a big topic in modern times today, about not just getting the end product of our foods, right? Just give me my food. I don't care what you did with it. Where now there's a much greater emphasis, right? There's the slow cooking movement. There's something called conscious cooking movement, where you care what ingredients go into it. You care, the process. It's not just about. In fact, there's a Harvard study now that is made a recommendation for teaching kitchens to teach people how to cook, not just so they know how to cook, but they say so they know how to live as well. That there's values that you learn at the table or at in the kitchen that you can then use throughout life. So that's one point that he begins to make. And he gives us a few other examples. In the second source, in Muvar Khan, it's also explained here in Shas and the Rambam, Debishlu v'acharkak tzla'u, that first you boiled it, and then you roasted it. So what would you think then is the halacha? You violated boiling it, but then you did the right thing and you roasted it. So he says, Lo nafich mitorat bishul. You have not taken it out of the world of bishul. That bishul, with the boiling, that still counts. You still have violated it, even if then you're presented with the piece of meat that seems fully roasted. Well, then there's a whole series of other issues you're talking about. Okay, we're not even going to get to the kashrut issues, but you're right. Those are potentially other concerns as well. Then he says, Im tzala, if you roasted it, etzel ha'or, me'at dehavena, what happens if you then you roasted it properly until the stage of na? It's still not fully roasted. The charkach, and then after you roasted it all the way through, but not on fire, like the chamei taveria. So now you did a little bit of the right start. Does it count? He says no. Okay? He's going to go on. If you go to the next paragraph, he gives us other examples. The third line, the im achal na. What happens if you ate it that it was na, so you violated na, umivushal, and you also ate it boiled, meaning you did everything wrong. You didn't roast it the proper amount, and then you also boiled it. You didn't even put it on roasting of something else. How many violations, how many times are you lashed as a result of that? So it's one piece of meat. Anyway, he says you're lashed double the amount. Each violation counts. Anyway, he gives a whole number of series of other examples. You can think for yourself of all the permutations of what you might do. If you boil it a little bit, and then you roast it, and you boil it again, you know, every different possibility. Anyway, what he says in all these instances, the last one we'll look at, just because I think it's an interesting one. The bottom left-hand corner. Regarding what I had spoken about before. Debishul im lo nitbashel kamachal ben drusai. Are you familiar with Machal ben Drusai? Machal ben Drusai was a thief, and he was always running away. It appears in the Gemara and Shabbat, and he's always running away from people who are trying to catch him and get their money back. And so he never had time to sit down for a good meal, and as a result, never being able to sit down for a good meal, he would only cook his food the bare minimum, and he would cook it basically a third of what everyone else would cook it, and then he would eat it and run. So that's a determining factor for a lot of things that have to do with Hilchot Shabbat and cooking. So for example, is it really cooked? So for example, you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. When have you violated that prohibition of not cooking on Shabbat? When you've cooked past the amount of Machal ben Drusai, meaning if you cook only a little bit and it's totally raw except for a little bit, that you haven't violated it. But if you cook Machal ben Drusai, which is basically a third of the preparation, so then you have violated Shabbat. So he says here, what happens if you boiled it, but you didn't boil it to the point of a third? So in the world of Shabbat, you haven't done anything yet. Eino over balav the mivushal rak dino kachai. It's according to the laws of Shabbat. It's like it's a raw piece, so you haven't violated the mivushal. So here too, if you then were to roast it afterwards, it seems that it would be mutar to eat because the first action you didn't do anything. Anyway, he goes down after a long reasoning, says it's not true. That too is violating mivushal, meaning we have a different halacha here than we would have regards to Shabbat. Now, why am I going into all those sort of the weeds of these possible details? What I think again and again and again he's trying to emphasize is the patience and the process. The process and that patience, meaning you cooked it a little bit. You may think that's nothing. No, that counts. You roasted it a little bit. That counts. Even if afterwards you've done something totally different. Even if the end result looks wonderful. It's not just the end, but it's also the means to get to the end that we're going to be focusing on. And so I think that's the first lesson that the Sefer Chinuch wants us to sort of focus about is you have to cook it all the way through and appreciate the moments in between. That's Okay, that's the first process. The second element of this mitzvah is, of course, the mivushal, the cooking. Before I get to that, I just want to say sort of tangentially, if any of you want to explore an interesting topic a little further, is the question of Chamei Tiberia, the hot springs of Tiberia. Because there's a very good question you could ask on the Minchat Chinuch, why he even asks whether or not roasting over the Chamei Tiberia would count. Can anyone guess what that question might be? Why is it a question that doesn't make any sense at all? Right. Yeah, so no, it is natural, but why is natural not a problem? I mean, he's asking it as a question. It's a legitimate question. Can you use natural? He's basically saying, could you roast it in the sun? It's the parallel idea. But why Chamei Tiberia specifically is problematic to ask about. Where did Korban Pesach have to take place? In the Beis Hamikdash, in Yerushalayim. So what's this idea of Chamei Tiberia at all? It never even would come up as a possibility. Anyway, there's a lot of different answers that people offer because the Minchas Chinuch is not asking it by himself. He's basing it upon a Gemara and why they raise this issue. And there's different answers of what they talk about. We have a source, for example, that says the power of Yerushalayim is that even the boiling in Tiberias comes from Yerushalayim, because there's a midrash that says, there's another idea, slightly less mystical, that says, in the future, the borders of Yerushalayim will be all the way up to Damascus. So that would include, it's actually very apropos of some of the laws they're trying to pass now of expanding the borders of Yerushalayim. Maybe they just expand it all the way to Tiberias, and then, I remember Lupliansky, the mayor of Lupliansky, had an idea. He wanted the airport to be called Jerusalem Airport, and he wanted the border to be extended all the way there. Not the border, but he wanted it to be called the Jerusalem Airport. There's other ideas about, with regards to, for example, the floodwaters. There is a teaching that says that the Chamei Tiberia is a generic term, and it means any type of boiling waters. And then there's a challenge that says, wait a second, Jerusalem couldn't have had any boiling waters because there's a midrash that says all the waters of the flood, right? There's a midrash that says the waters of the flood came up, not just came down, came up, but none of them came from Israel. So it couldn't be that there was boiling waters here. The Eglei Tal has, I think, the most interesting one. He says they had some form of thermos where they could take the boiling waters in Tiberia and bring them down, and they could still use them. Anyway, it's a interesting topic for further exploration, but not our main issue here. Okay, let's talk about the second issue. The second issue that I wanted to mention is the concept of mivushal, of cooking with water. Water usually is a positive thing. Water is usually referred to as a bracha. But here, with regards to Pesach, certainly here with the Korban Pesach, we don't want water to attach to it. By the way, more than just a little bit of water. I didn't bring the one source for you to see, but if you look at, what? You want soup, okay, but not with any of the mitzvot, right? There's not a mitzvah to have soup on Pesach, right? There is a mitzvah to eat matzah. Make sure there's no water touching your matzah.
Tender, and it can be more tender if you cook it a lot, than for home for a child.
No, there's no doubt about it, but halachically speaking, the rabbis and the Torah are terrified of having water in our meal with regards to Pesach. Well, that's a good question. Why? Well, but let me just give you examples of what I mean. Matzah. We don't want to have water here, Pesach. We don't want to have water connected to the Korban Pesach. By the way, not just in its cooking. The Mishnah, I'm reading from, in Pesachim, from Ayin Daled, Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says, how are you supposed to cook the Korban Pesach? And it says, you stick in a shipud, a stick from a rimon, from a pomegranate tree. And it says, well, why not a metal one? It says, well, the metal itself gets so hot, maybe the cooking is taking place from the metal and not from the roasting. And then it says, well, what about a deco, right? A palm frond. And then it gives other options, or this type of tree, or this type of tree. The Gemara gives many, many different answers of other trees. What's the difference? Why it has to be a rimon? And the answer it gives for each tree, or why we don't use it, is because they have liquid inside of them, and we're afraid that the liquid, even the small amount that's inside the tree, inside the branch, will, and a rimon doesn't have this apparently, will be cooking the meat as opposed to roasting it. And we're very terrified about that. Everything goes back. But roast? Okay, could be. I want to say something more. I want to say there's something about water that we're concerned about. Water bloats things up, and we'll get to chametz. When we talk about chametz, we'll talk about that idea as well. Other examples where Pesach is afraid of water, symbolically speaking. We also have, Okay, so I'm gonna come to that in just a half a second. With regards to Pesach itself, it's at the beginning of the spring, right? The rabbis extend Adar. We get an extra Adar to make sure that it doesn't rain over Pesach, because we want people to be able to travel here. But again, we don't want Pesach to be filled with water in that regard. Pesach's the beginning of the summer, where the color of the summer is brown, right? It's, again, I can give many, many different examples that Pesach seems to be terrified to water. Now, contrast that with Sukkot. Sukkot, water is blessing galore, right? The Simcha Beit HaShoeva, you have to have water be able to come into your sukkah, as one of the signs of whether or not it's kosher. We're judged for water on Sukkot. All the items, even for example, the rabbis point out that the pre-Eitz Hadar, what makes the etrog beautiful? So some suggest that they specifically, that the Torah, well, not the Torah, but that there's a play on words between Hadar, which describes the etrog, and the Greek word for water, hydro, that they were trying to make some type of connection. All the four species grow by water. The willow grows by water. They all have water. Anyway, there's water and water is viewed as a blessing. It's viewed as a manifest God's involvement in our world, and it's a very positive thing. But water has I would say, potential negative side to it as well. And that's the water that has to do with great abundance. It's a blessing, but it can lead to also a curse in some ways. And you see it with the Nile perhaps most strongly. The people living in Egypt, the Nile just overflowed the banks, and their crops would grow perfectly natural, right? All of a sudden, they have a great deal of leisure time. Many people point out that the beginning of great sins take place when people have leisure time. Sodom and Gomorrah is Lot. Why does he pick stone? He picks stone because he looks down and he sees that it's a well-watered place. And indeed, there's agriculture that takes place, and that allows for a surplus to take place. Modern archaeologists tell us that human beings began as shepherds, and then they moved to agriculture. Agriculture was much wealthier, that it had to do with creating surpluses, and also that's where crime began, because people would congregate into cities, and crime began there. That Abraham, it's not by accident, is a shepherd. He's moving from place to place to place. He doesn't have the luxury that water produces. And so therefore, God punishes the Egyptians with water. The Nile is struck, right? It's the first source of the plagues. The Egyptians themselves are killed, right, in the water. Rabbi Sachs has an interesting point. They have filled with such pride of their technology and their power that their Nile produced for them, so they're killed in water. That he tells the story, he suggests that their chariots, which is also symbolic of their technology, got stuck in the mud, right? And the water wasn't like crashing down as you see in all the movies. The water actually came back slowly, and little by little was rising and rising, and the Egyptians, picture this image, they could have gotten out, but they were on their chariots trying to fix them and saying, there's no way that our chariots won't save us. And they couldn't leave their chariots, and they actually drowned because they couldn't leave their valuables and their sign of their technological prowess. They couldn't leave that behind. So the water is a source of curse in this regards, because the water leads to potentially a lifestyle that, in a sense, engenders this type of cursing. So I'd like to suggest, with regards to Israel, it's different, right? In Israel, we get water, but we have to pray for it. We have to look up to God. We don't get too much of it. Right? I can see we're already going to be in trouble. We have this beautiful, gorgeous day, but we know we're going to pay for this beautiful, gorgeous day, right, when the Kinneret doesn't go up as a result of the rain. So we have to pray to God. So here, our relationship with water brings us closer to God. In Egypt, the relationship with water sort of separated. It gave you a sense of strength. I don't need it, and I don't need God, and the like. So Pesach, one suggestion about Pesach is that it's all about fire, and it's all about two different ways of coming close to God. There's the blessing that God gives to the water, and then there's also the purification process. That's fire, of walking through the desert, of the struggle, of all the things that fire represents. The matzah goes through the fire. That's one way of sort of coming close to God, through a powerful purification process. I'd like to suggest a different answer that's symbolized by all the lack of water on Pesach, the brown and the wandering in the desert and the like. And I hate to do this, but I'll give you an absolutely terrible image to sort of introduce why I'm going to suggest what I'm going to suggest. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. In Phoenix, it's an incredibly dry heat, but it's very hot. Anyway, every single year, the newscasters make a point of telling us that even though you didn't feel that you were sweating today, each and every one of you sweat a tremendous amount. It's dry, but your sweat was immediately evaporated. And the amount of sweat that the collective population of Phoenix engaged in on this day, and then they give in terms of swimming pools, Olympic-sized swimming pools. Usually it's about 5 or 6 Olympic-sized swimming pools of sweat were produced by the people of Phoenix today that you didn't see. As I say, it's a terrible image, right? These swimming pools filled of sweat, but it's a very powerful image also. There's all these things that you didn't see. Go back to the flood for just a moment. What was the sin of the people during the time of the flood? So there's different answers given. One answer is that they had tremendous arrogance. They said, God's going to try to, shoot up from the springs. We'll cover it with steel. God is going to shoot water from above. We have sponges that can collect them. Rabbi Yochanan, however, gives a different answer. He says, what was the sin? And it's the sin I think we're probably more familiar with, is that people would go through the shuk, and they would take a grape. That's it. So no one could say that they were stealing. They only stole a little nothing. And they would do very small little sins that never amounted to that much, never amounted to a measurable sin. And so they could say at the end, I did nothing. They're always very, very small things. The only thing that would stop a person from stealing a very, very small thing is belief in God, right? Because it's belief in God. If you believe God sees you, because society can't judge you for that small little amount. That's what they understood the sin in the time. And I think there's a connection, this idea of seeing God in our relationship to the very small things. The concept of na was to see sort of the importance of small moments. I'd like to say you can see also the importance of small things. And I'd like now to turn to the concept of water. So when you're in the desert, I'd like to argue that Pesach is not about rejecting water. It's about realizing that water is all around us, but it's hidden. Right? There's water in matzah. Have you ever made matzah? If you make matzah, you have to pour water into it. It's just you have to be extremely careful to make sure that you cook it in the proper time. There is water in the desert. When you're walking in the desert, right, it's hidden. You don't see it, right? All those things. There's certainly water in the animal when you're putting it in the Korban Pesach. We're not adding any more water. But we know that most of animals, just like most human beings, are made up of water. But we don't see it, but it's certainly there. And what I think the Torah is trying to get at with this idea that you can't mivushal, you can't add water, is to start sensitizing us to realize that God's blessings are with us all the time, even if they're not obvious. Half the year, right, from Sukkot to Pesach, we're supposed to, in a sense, feel God's blessings in a very manifest way. We're supposed to see the miracles are everywhere, and we really feel God's glory as the rain comes down, and we thank God and for all our material well-being. And then from Pesach to Sukkot, in the heat of the summer, we develop a different talent. The other talent is when you don't see any blessing, you don't see God's involvement, it's all hidden, but to realize that it's there nevertheless. That's what I'd like to suggest is actually taking place with this mitzvah of that you can't mivushal. In the eating of the Korban Pesach, you're eating water that's hidden. And I'll just end by this, and then I'll take your question of what's the perfect example of this? What halachic change takes place at Sukkot, and then from Pesach on? What do we always change? In the davening, what words do we change? Exactly, right? Oh, by the way, we say Mashiva Ruach Umrid HaGeshem, right? That's from Sukkot. And at Pesach we say Morid HaTal, okay? By the way, mostly only in Israel, which kind of speaks about this connection of really feeling God. Now, what is Tal? So, Tal is water, right? It's dew, but it's also water. It's just a totally different type of water. It's Lahavdil, it's like that sweat in Phoenix, right? You can't see it, but it's there. I mean, when you walk out and you see the Tal, it meant that water was in the air the whole night. You can't see it, but there's water here all the time. And that's, when we say that Morid HaTal, that's what I think the Chazal are trying to get us to realize, is that there's water here. It's the blessing here. God is here. It's just hidden. But you have to recognize it nevertheless. That's the idea of rejecting the water. And I'll just end with this teaching of the Maharal. The Maharal says, when it comes to Breshit, that rain is only created after Adam and Chava are created. Rain doesn't come in the very beginning. But how do then the plants survive without rain? So he says, there is Tal. There was always water. The whole reason why there's only rain after Adam and Chava are created is because Adam and Chava needed to be able to say thank you, or God needed them to be able to say thank you. And so if there's no human beings to appreciate the rain, so there's no reason for the rain. God can do it a different way. God does it through Tal, but the Tal is always there, the blessing is always there, the water is always there. And I suggest, based upon this Maharal, is that part of the tikkun, after we leave Gan Eden, is to be able to actually thank God also for the Tal. Meaning, in our early primordial state, we needed the obvious blessings. We had to actually be hit over the head that God is with us. But as we develop, we still have to, but the goal is not to be hit over the head. The goal is to be able to see the blessings, to see the Tal, realize that it's a blessing, and you don't need to mivushal everything. Have a good week.